On this day when we celebrate the revelation of the Prince of Peace to the world, many of us are painfully aware that Christmas was canceled this year in Bethlehem because of the war between Israel and Hamas. The story of Christmas, said the Reverend Munther Isaac, the Palestinian pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, is Jesus born into hardship, lived under occupation, survived a massacre, and became a refugee. This is a story we Palestinians can understand. Not far from Reverend Isaac's church, Franciscan friar Rami Ezekray, pastor of St. Catherine's Church, made a broader statement about the solidarity offered by the message of the season. It's impossible to celebrate when so many on both sides have lost so much, he said. We canceled the festivities as a sign of solidarity with the victims of the war. Two voices from the same city, the same religion, the same ethno-national group interpreting their contemporary situation from slightly different perspectives. Noticing these slightly different perspectives is so important when discussing this region, as I'm about to do. It avoids the reductionist tendency to lump together people groups, whether those groups be Jews or Arabs, Israelis or Palestinians, residents of Gaza, Israel, or the West Bank, into a faceless mass of a single point of view, which is so often what happens when it comes to discussing this region. Jews believe this or do this. Palestinians think or do that. Reducing people into a single narrative is what we do to people to make them serve our own ideological interests. It is often the precursor to legitimizing violence against a particular group. And unfortunately, it is the strong pull that many of us are experiencing today as this regional conflict quickly becomes a new litmus test for progressive ideology here at home. I want to set reasonable expectations for a sermon on the current conflict today. If I knew how to solve the political problems of the region, I'd be working for the State Department, not pastoring a church. And if I thought any of us could have a huge impact for peace through public actions from afar, I'd be the first one lining up for the effort. Like many of you, I've been disturbed by some of the public actions stateside that have wed their calls to peace with ideological positions that ignore legitimate suffering and legitimate interests of Palestinians on the one side or Israelis on the other. I don't think that insinuating that Israel shouldn't exist leads to peace with justice. And I don't think that insinuating that because Hamas won the last elections, that Palestinians in Gaza have forfeit their right not to be bombed. I don't think that leads to peace with justice either. Also, I am very well aware that saying anything about this conflict has been a losing proposition for just about any leader of any public institution. And yet I know that from all my work with families and communities and our church, that burying conflict never brings healing. We've got to learn how to discuss differences, hold different perspectives, even when our perspective doesn't win. The real win is the communication that happens between us. It is the negotiation that happens when people in relationship are challenged to deal with our differences without tearing each other apart. It is the thing that can lead us to peace. So my goal today isn't for you to believe or think what I believe or think. It's to give us theological grounding for a conversation, a dialogue that leads to deeper understanding, and to open us to each other's pain and grief, not to add to it, but so that we can shoulder that pain and grief together. The biblical story today offers us a window into the role that outsiders might play in doing our part to welcome the light of God into the world. The primary role of those magi outsiders is to demonstrate their openness to receiving knowledge in several different modes. A secondary role they play is conspiring together against violence. We need their wisdom today to support peace at a time when courage by leaders at the highest levels has been lacking, and the arrogance that always accompanies faith in violence has reached a new high. We need magi wisdom today so that we can support our neighbors and family members who are grieving the loss of life in the region and working through their fear and terror without allowing that grief or that terror to blind us from our own responsibility as citizens of a nation whose money and munitions implicate all of us in decisions that are being made there. And we need magi wisdom to question our own motives behind opinions about such things as Jews and Muslims, Zionism, occupation, and terrorism. Recognizing that historically Christian beliefs about and actions toward all of these things have caused great harm to people and their cultures. The Magi used their knowledge not as a reason to rest from their quest for greater understanding, but in a way to deepen it. Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, once said that the most erroneous stories are those we think we know best and therefore never scrutinize or question. Howard Thurman made the point in his landmark book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that hatred often begins in situations where there is contact without fellowship or warmth. It is very painful when we succeed in maintaining fellowship with Jews who are deeply connected to Israel, while also maintaining fellowship with Palestinians who are deeply connected to the same or adjacent land. It's painful because the grievances are often legitimate. It is true that Jews have been living in the land for thousands of years before the birth of Christ. It is true that anti-Semitism is probably the oldest, longest-standing form of systematic hatred known to human beings that has sometimes infected institutions on both the left and the right. When you look at all the ways that nations, including modern democratic states, fail to protect the lives of Jews consistently in history, including but also beyond the Holocaust, you can better understand why Jews around the world look to the modern-day state of Israel, a piece of land roughly the size of New Jersey, as the one place in the world and in their history where they call the shots about their own security. And even today, as we've seen from white supremacist actions from UVA to the Tree of Life synagogue massacre to the slaughter of Jews on October 7th, there are people who want to kill Jews simply because they are Jews. At the same time, there are many Palestinians who were forcibly removed from the land they had occupied for generations in order to establish the modern-day state of Israel. Many of those same Palestinians have been less than fully free, living in the West Bank or in Gaza, where they have been subjected to all kinds of restrictions on their freedom, including limitations in their travel across borders, hampering their economic possibilities and their dignity. And when it comes to Gaza, sometimes their basic subsistence. They have been forced to choose between a militant terrorist organization that promises them a future only through armed conflict on the one hand, and an ineffective, often corrupt regime on the other, while the West vacillates between the promise of a two-state solution with weak or no accountability for the Israeli government when it has undermined that process, or the single-state support debacle of the Trump administration that has led many Palestinians to conclude that the peace process was a sham all along. So many of the grievances are legitimate, which is what makes it so hard to stay in relationship with people on both sides of this bloody conflict. Yet that is what Christians are called to do. Stay in relationship, to hold the pain of the grievances, honor the losses, understand the interests, and work toward the long-term relationship building that is necessary to support peace. We have to grow in our understanding of what is perhaps the most perplexing, complicated conflict on the planet, grow constantly, repeatedly in our understanding again and again and again. Those magi got to Bethlehem by using their existing knowledge and expertise of signs in the heavens in order to travel to the place where they thought they would find a king, to Jerusalem. But once there, they had to suspend their prior judgment by receiving new information, first from prophets outside of their own faith and outside of their own culture, enabling them to follow a star to a place where they found a child. Then, before returning home, they paid attention to their own dreams that led them once again to change their previously held direction and go a different way. They received new knowledge time and time again only because they were open to it. This new understanding is what prepared them to take the right action, small action, to interrupt the violence of a king. They went home by a different way to avoid enabling a violent king. Indeed, if there is a side for us to take in this conflict, it is a side against more violence. We must be able to see and say that killing children or any civilian never has any justification, whether by armed terrorists intent on killing Jews or not smart enough bombs that dehumanize citizens by labeling them in that convenient category of collateral damage. We must be able to observe and name that disrupting the Oslo peace process has been the shared goal of both the Netanyahu government and Hamas for the last 20 years. And we must acknowledge the hopeful signs that a great number of citizens are aware of the power motives of their own leadership. Indeed, prior to Hamas's brutal attack on Israeli civilians on the 7th, lots of Israelis were rising up against Prime Minister Netanyahu's shameless efforts to hold on to power by eliminating the Israeli Supreme Court's check on him. And prior to October 7th, 67% of Palestinian residents in Gaza, according to one poll, had little or no trust in Hamas, with some describing its rule as a second occupation. Tom Friedman, a columnist for the New York Times whose writing on the conflict is some of the most informed and even-handed, recently pointed out that leaders on both sides of this conflict have had lots of choices, and indeed continue to have choices today. It will take pressure from peacemakers on both sides to make those leaders choose peace. For Israel, that means stopping the bombing, which at this point has no coherent strategic objective. For those who have told me that the objective is to wipe Hamas off the map, well, the U.S. tried to do something similar after 9/11. Our particular choice to invade a country that had nothing to do with 9/11 led to the deaths of tens of thousands and made even more enemies of the United States. The world then would have supported the U.S. to dismantle al-Qaeda and bring their leader to justice, just as the world will still support Israel to bring those hostages home and dismantle Hamas. But the world will not continue to support Israel in the humanitarian nightmare that tells millions of Gazans to move south and then bombs them there. The horrific slaughtering of Jews on October 7th doesn't justify the deaths of what is now more than 20,000 people in Gaza, mostly civilians, just as Israel's occupation couldn't justify Hamas's killings on October the 7th. Peace takes courage, restraint, and magi wisdom that is focused on future possibilities. Now, if all of this sounds ridiculously impossible in an election year, well, then let us return to our responsibility as citizens and people of faith in a democracy. Speak the truth in love even before it looks like a reasonable reality. Do the thing that politicians don't feel they can do publicly in the face of lobbying from so many interests involved in the region. Honor the losses of our friends and neighbors. Support the two-state solution going forward. Hold leaders on both sides accountable to the policies that lead toward it. Grow in our own understanding of the complex relationship between religion, politics, and violence. Support Israel in its efforts to secure the release of hostages in the short term and dismantle Hamas in the long. Support Palestinians in their efforts to create their own nation. Invest in peacemaking efforts of Palestinian and Israeli citizen leaders on the ground whose long-term relationships are the best hope to lead us all to the joy that we are seeking and searching for. And finally, speak out against authoritarian leaders at home and abroad who use enemies to distract us from focusing on their own malevolent designs. Indeed, the most important way we can participate in Epiphany today, welcoming the light into the world for everyone, is to reject the enemy-making mentality that has infected our politics like a cancer. The lie that the land isn't big enough for you and me. Reject that mentality everywhere you encounter it in big and small ways. Things like the church service isn't big enough for your kind of music and mine. The church community can't hold your opinion about the way we spend money and mine. The city can't support investing in uptown and downtown. What's good for Baltimore has to be bad for the Eastern Shore or Western Maryland. The country isn't big enough for people who live here and for refugees escaping violence or misery. If your candidate doesn't win, it's winner take all for me and my tribe, but if my candidate doesn't win, we throw out the rules altogether. It's me versus you, us versus them. Which brings us back to the Reverends Isaac and Azachre's slightly different perspectives from Bethlehem, where that little child was born more than 2,000 years ago. There is room for both of their narratives, just as there was room for that special child in the world. Those slightly different narratives speak to each other, challenge each other, to account for the reality of injustice on the one hand, and not lose sight for the vision of peace for everyone on the other. There is room for more than just those two narratives, expanding beyond their same city, their same religion, their same ethno-national group. My suffering doesn't cancel yours out. The need for justice on one side doesn't eliminate the need for justice on the other. There is room to hold all of it and take steps, however tiny, toward healing that leads us toward peace. Violence will not lead us there. It never has. Oh, I'll grant it may be necessary sometimes to protect the lives of the innocent or even to bring some to justice, but that's the most it can do. To build a world that works for you and me, it takes making room in the world for the other, whoever the other may be. Indeed, in the heart of God, there seems to be no category of other. We are all God's children. That is the message of Epiphany. May our understanding of this truth deepen as we open ourselves to the hurt and the suffering in the world, and thereby discover the joy that God wants us to find together.